Welcome to episode 3 of Data Trends with Maritza. I'm Craig Stewart, CEO and founder of Dalebrook Media. Last time you saw myself and Maritza was on the eve of the Rugby World Cup, and Maritza's prediction was correct that the Springboks won. I think
Yes.
It was very scientific and very gut feel at the same time. So good news. Not so good news for the Proteas yesterday, but it was a good fight. But that's sport, I think, at the end of the day. And you'll notice that there's someone else joining us. So Data Trends with Maritza and Janine West, who's joining us today to talk about data privacy and protection. Janine's from NTT and been working with us in the data community as well for the last few years. Janine, so good to have you involved with this one.
Thank you. Thank you, Craig. It's great to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. Cool. All right. So as I said, we're talking data privacy and protection. Now, this is obviously an area, a topic, a challenge that organizations face on a constant basis. It's not something that's going away. I think it's certainly something that is trending because of a number of different factors, which we're going to go into now. So Maritza, why don't you just kick off? Obviously, it's your trend, it's the research that you've been doing. Give us some of your thoughts, the drivers, etc. And then Janine, being sort of a legal expert in this area, can come in with some of the legalese and regulations and all the other things that people need to know about.
Okay, so I'm not going to say too much about the legal side of things then, because I think that is absolutely the primary driver for why data protection and data privacy is the #1 trend in the industry. And we're seeing more and more legislation coming up. So not just data privacy legislation, we're also seeing AI legislation, etc. So definitely a big driver. And then, of course, the other driver is just concerns around data security, information security, because of cyber attacks or increased and more sophisticated cyber attacks and data breaches. And then I think the third trend is everything else that is trending in the organization, in the industry, opening up new ways of storing data, sharing data, new types of platforms, new technologies, even new types of data. And all of these things are contributing to concerns around the protection and the safety of that data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can get into some of those things later on, but I think also things like hyper-personalization, Gen AI, which is one of the things we really want to kind of cover, as well as data sharing, which we covered in episode 1. So you talked there about some, new legislation or upcoming legislation. Obviously, people looking very closely at AI, making sure there's policies in place and things like that. Janine, maybe we'll come to you. Maybe you can give us a bit of an update on, what's in the market at the moment and maybe what's on the horizon as well.
Oh, I think there is. You'll see. I mean, it is definitely the buzzword, and trying to keep up with it at the moment requires, I think, at least 2 to 3 hours of sleepless, less sleep at night, because it is something comes out every single day. I think the big ones we're looking at the moment is the EU issuing their legislation. We're waiting for that now. I believe it was it came to a bit of a standpoint yesterday because there were a few arguments going back and forth. It's a very difficult one because there's this everybody wants to progress. We want to be part of the digital economy. We see the benefits of AI when you look at things like a co-pilot and those kind of things. However, we've all got that that sort of fearfulness around what was it? You think it's going to now take over the world. We're going to have that whole thing with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So you've got this big fear in people. There's like this push to go ahead, and then there's the sudden, fear of, this gut-wrenching, what could it do? What is going to happen? So it's watching that. We saw also President Biden issued, guidance around it. So we're sort of on the brink of getting all of this issued. We've heard from our own South African information regulator that they are busy looking at implementing rules around it. So it's a big thing to see sort of who's first to the platform. And then also, how do we align with those? And will they have common trends? When the EU GDPR came out, we saw that the rest of the data protection legislation sort of followed that trend and has closely aligned. So we're hoping that there'll be similarities and you're not going to have vast differences that you've got to try comply with.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's a complex thing. I guess the question that comes to mind for me, Maritza, from your side, as a head of data, and Janine, you can add later, as sort of obviously advising companies on this. How do you go about building performance into the data, the insights, the augmented analytics, etc., while still playing by the rules? Because I think that's always been the challenge. And I recall having these conversations over the years around, is it a handbrake? Is it something that helps the business? All that sort of thing. So Maritza, maybe you can sort of just give us some thoughts, like how do data professionals utilize this and build it into what they're trying to do from an insights perspective?
Yeah, I honestly think that data governance can be an enabler. It doesn't have to be a blocker, and it really goes around, or it's based on how you implement it in your organization. And I think when you look at modern data platforms and modern organizations that's on a data and a digital transformation journey, you also have to rethink your data governance approach. So you can't apply old school, rigid type of data governance in a modern organization. So you have to look at your data governance operating model and you have to modernize it. And that requires some really serious shifts. And sometimes those shifts are very difficult to make. And one of those shifts, and this is not just a shift in the business, I think it's also in IT security teams, in risk teams, as well as in data teams, specifically the data governance side, is there has to be a shift away from data governance is a compliance-driven exercise to a data governance can be an enabler for your organization. And it's not the easiest thing to do. It's easy to say it in a conversation like this, but I think it's something that you have to apply to all of the areas of your organization, whether it is technology, embedding it into processes so that people don't even know they're doing data governance. They're just doing it. They don't have to think about it. And then also adjusting your data governance approach depending on the use case. So there might still be some use cases where you need more rigid data governance, for example, compliance reporting, maybe, or sharing data with third parties. Maybe you want to have some rigidity and robustness around that. But then if you have a data science platform and your data scientists need to work in a certain way, maybe you can be a little bit more flexible, but still be safe. So I think it's really re-looking at your entire data governance operating model and modernizing it.
Yeah.
Nice challenge.
Yeah. Good stuff. Janine, from your side on that?
No, I fully agree with that. I think it's bringing it in. A lot of people saw it as sort of the red tape around everything, and now looking at it and saying, actually, how do we embrace it and make it part of our culture and make it exciting and let people see the benefits? In my space, I try and encourage it. I try to get it onto all the projects where there's sort of the risky things that are happening. I say, let me be the tester. Let me help you pilot it. Bring me with you. Let's see what it is. Because I think there's always been this understanding that sort of from a governance perspective, from a compliance perspective, we just you want to put up the red tape and say, no, you've got to play within these. It's now saying, actually, let me see what you want to do. Let me understand it, but then come and understand my world as well. And while we've got to do this.
I do have a question for Janine, and it's based on the conversation we're having now, but also something you said earlier, and it's the consequences of getting ready for compliance to all of this legislation and the cost of compliance. Because if you want a sustainable implementation of the structures, the people, the roles, the technology, etc., to support a continued, almost like a BAU operationalization of compliance, that is expensive. And that is probably one of the biggest consequences of being compliant to legislation. And there is some overlap between, how you have to set yourself up to be compliant to different types of leisure. But I was just wondering if, we do get to the point where we need to comply to AI legislation, is there going to be something new we need to think about? In addition to how we set up our data governance teams or our data governance operating model, that's been usually driven by privacy legislation. Will we have to rethink things, or will it just be an evolution?
I think that's a great question. Because I think it is definitely, it's one of the things that make most people quite fearful, because people look at it as a completely separate thing. It is new, it is different. The scary part is, as you touched on earlier, Craig, was the generative piece of it, where it starts to sort of learn and teach itself. But I think the main thing around AI is looking that you've got your normal controls in place as you would for any piece of technology, and assessing it. And then looking specifically, because the big thing around AI we know is the ethical use of AI, and looking at it from that point of view, and questioning what is that information, what can be found, what does it create. You've seen the cases where they've actually got tools now in universities to try and pick up if students have used AI. There's been a lot of talk around the fact that some students were told that the tool had traced that they had used AI in their research, and they actually hadn't. So that came back, what were the repercussions? What is the difference? The whole of data privacy is always around, sort of protecting the individual. And I think AI is the next step on that. It's just looking at what data are you collecting? What are you able to work out and derive from that data? And what does it do? What kind of a profile? So it's just sort of going that path and actually questioning it as well. So I would say your normal checks that you would do on technology, and then you're adding in that different flavor because you've got that extra growth with it.
I mean, I think that's quite comforting, as a layperson, but just sort of my understanding, that's quite coming, that is, like you asked me, it's not a massive shift, like it's more of an evolution as it goes. I think so many people are into AI across their organizations anyway, right? I mean, it's not something that is brand new. No one's ever heard of it. It's been in business for quite a long time. I think it's just around that generative AI piece, the large language models, it's teaching itself. And I think also people just filling in data, right? Like, the question of prompt engineering is very often pulling data from various areas or whatever it may be. And I think that's maybe where the challenge is coming in. It's just that sort of lack of understanding. But on the face of it, doesn't seem incredibly hard. But again, that's me running an events business, not running big organizations like yourself. So
I think, Craig, if I can just add, the one thing I would urge is just the caution around where people go in, and I think that was the biggest thing with the chat GPT, is just being cautious about what information you give and understanding where it goes. So that's the only caution I would urge, is just saying, like, when you're looking at these sort of external models, like what do they do with information? Where does it feed back to? Is it still your IP? And I think that's the important thing to look at, as well as I said, as well as the ethics. But it's very important to just know that when you're loading it, don't put in your company information, your personal information, unless you know that is where it's going to, it could end up in a place you don't want it to end up.
Yeah.
I want to add on to that. I think it's really important, firstly, that people in your organization has the right information, the right knowledge. So I think training is really, really important, because not everyone has a full understanding of what personal information is. I think most people have a very limited understanding. I think it's your name and your contact details and your phone number, maybe. But of course, it's a lot wider if you look at the different categories that's in GDPR and POPI. So that would be the first thing, is to make sure that people are actually educated on that, so that they can make informed decisions. But also, again, coming back to the question around, okay, how do you do this safely and, without becoming a blocker? I think one of the most important things you can do in your organization, and by the way, this is driven by both GDPR and POPI, is privacy impact assessments. And there's very specific scenarios that the legislation outlines where you have to do these impact assessments. I'm going to say, if you're going to process, share personal information, do an impact assessment. They don't take long. They're very straightforward. And it's just, a comfort when you start a project, when you start a new or launch a new product, or a new service, that you do that impact assessment and that you can say hand on heart, we've thought through all of these things that Janine mentioned. Is there automated decisioning? Is there, what type of data are we processing or sharing, etc.? And I think that is probably the easiest thing to implement in your organization. It's got no cost. There's no cost to implementing it. And like I say, in terms of time, it doesn't take a lot of time, but it does give comfort. So easiest thing for any organization to implement.
And something that you'd also, I suppose, you'd also put as part of your records of processing activities is understanding the end-to-end flow of the data.
Yes.
Where does it go across to a third party and or cross borders? And I know you covered that was it episode 1? So is there cross-border data transfers? What mechanisms have you got in place for that? So I think it's all part of that is understanding where that data flows and what mechanisms do you have in place for it. So
100%.
All right, good stuff. So I think there's been some good advice as we kind of come to the 20-minute mark there. I'm going to ask each of you maybe to just give your sort of key takeaway. The one piece of advice, people listening to this that are working with data within their organizations, doing the analytics, come with insights, obviously pulling customer data, etc., who are a little bit sort of mindful or I guess scared of the data privacy and protection side. It does seem like a very scary area. What are maybe each of you just the one thing that you can say to kind of quell those concerns and let people feel comfortable about working in this environment? So Maritza, let's start with you.
Okay, so I'm going to say that not all data is equal. And as an organization, you have to understand what is your critical data. And like I said earlier, you have to have an understanding of what personal data you have, and adding on to what Janine said, where you actually process that data. So your record of processing activities. And if you've got that in place, then I think you've got a really good foundation for decision making in future.
All right, perfect. Janine?
So I think from my side, it's pretty much echoing what Maritza said. Make sure you've got your controls. You apply the same controls and your additional controls where you feel it's necessary. And then also just to not be scared. I think people think there's some big golden rule out there around this and someone knows about it. I think we're all learning. We're all on this journey together. So I know within our privacy community, we all share, we discuss these topics because there's so much changing. So don't be scared to ask, to research, to learn about it, but make sure you've got your controls in place and take it from there.
All right, good. I think my takeaway was similar. Something you said sort of quite early on in the call, Janine, was about taking risk and compliance on the journey with you from a data analytics perspective or business in general perspective. Don't look at that like the police or like, oh, if we don't tell them, it'll probably be okay. Rather, bring them into the journey, into the development, involve them in the process that, you kind of within those guardrails and things get done a lot quicker rather than having to track back or take massive risks and end up with some sort of massive penalty or breach or whatever it may be. So.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
I'm going to say Janine and I will bring the sexy back to data governance.
There we go. You heard it here first. So good stuff. And I think with that, it sort of brings to the end of the 2023 sort of run of data trends with Maritza. And our next episode really will be going into 2024 trends, which is kind of mind-blowing in itself. But one thing that does mean is that December's around the corner, so that's a good thing. So, Janine, thank you so much. I think you've been saying that since September.
I have.
Janine, thanks so much for joining us. It was really great to have you on and for bringing your expertise. And Maritza, thanks again. Been a good episode, and look forward to the next one.
Yes, thanks both. It was a lovely chat.